Hi friends, I'm here with another story for Teacher Appreciation Week. This one is called Teacher Appreciation Day, and it's written by Lynn, Plourde and illustrated by Thor, Wickstrom. Teacher Appreciation Day was tomorrow, and everyone in Mrs. Shepherd's class knew exactly how they would show their appreciation to Mrs. Shepherd. Everyone, that is, except Maybella Jean Wishy-Washy. Maybella couldn't seem to make up her mind, no matter how hard she tried. Eeny, meeny, miny, moe. So many choices, I just don't know. That night at the supermarket, all of the students stopped for a treat to bring into Mrs. Shepherd. They crowded into the produce aisle and grabbed all kinds of apples. Early Macs, Late Macs, Red Delicious, Yellow Delicious, Granny Smith, and Grampy Smith. As they walked to the checkout line, they all scrubbed, polished, sheened, and shined those apples. They chose apples for Mrs. Shepherd because everyone knows apples are the official teacher treat. Meanwhile, Maybella wandered up and down the store aisles, from the deli to the dairy to the bakery to the pasta to the seafood to the frozen foods. She couldn't make up her mind about a treat for Mrs. Shepherd. Eeny, meeny, miny, moos. So many foods, how can I choose? The next day, when Mrs. Shepherd's students got ready for school, they dressed in green, all shades of green. Grassy green, lima bean green, pickle green, olive green, and leprechaun green. They wore green everything. Green pants, green shirts, green dresses, green headbands, green suspenders, and green underwear. One girl even painted her freckles green. They all wore green because it was Mrs. Shepherd's favorite color. She'd said so on the first day of school. Meanwhile, Maybella pulled all of her clothes out of her dresser and closet. She tried on reddish oranges and orangish reds, greenish blues and bluish greens, pinkish purples and purplish pinks, yellowish golds and goldish yellows. She couldn't make up her mind about a special outfit to wear for Mrs. Shepherd. Eeny, meeny, miny, mick. So many colors that I could pick. Mrs. Shepherd smiled a supersized smile when her students arrived wearing green, bearing apples, and shouting, "Happy Teacher Appreciation Day, Mrs. Shepherd! You're the best teacher! Thanks for being our teacher! Hooray for Mrs. Shepherd!" "Thank you, everyone," said Mrs. Shepherd. "I love apples." Then she saw Maybella Jean Wishy-Washy. "I couldn't decide what color to wear for you, so I wore everything. And I couldn't decide which treat to bring you, so I brought everything." "Well, that was very thoughtful of you," answered Mrs. Shepherd. During morning work time, student after student cleaned the chalkboard for Mrs. Shepherd. They sprayed it, squirted it, swabbed it, and squeegeed it until every single speck of chalk dust had disappeared. "Thank you, everyone," said Mrs. Shepherd. "It looks great." Meanwhile, Maybella borrowed paper towels, cleaners, buckets, mops, and a vacuum from the janitor's closet. She couldn't make up her mind which part of the classroom to clean for Mrs. Shepherd. "Eeny, meeny, miny, mean. So many places, what should I clean?" "I couldn't decide what to clean for you, Mrs. Shepherd, so I cleaned everything," said Maybella. That was very helpful of you," answered Mrs. Shepherd. During art, Mrs. Shepherd's students painted special pictures for her. They painted her Irish setter, Sadie. Mrs. Shepherd talked about Sadie all the time, as though she were a kid and not a dog. One day, Mrs. Shepherd even brought Sadie to a school picnic. They wore matching baseball caps and sunglasses. Mrs. Shepherd loved the pictures of Sadie. "Thank you, everyone," she said. "I'll hang these up." Meanwhile, when Maybella started to paint Sadie, she thought that Mrs. Shepherd might like kittens, too, or perhaps horses, or maybe gerbils or giraffes, or penguins, or puffins, or aardvarks, or anteaters, or octopuses, or possums. She couldn't make up her mind about which pet to draw for Mrs. Shepherd. "Eeny, meeny, miny, mess. So many pets, I'll never guess." "I couldn't decide which pet to paint for you, Mrs. Shepherd, so I painted every one." That was very, generous of you," said Mrs. Shepherd. At recess time, students raced around the schoolyard field and plucked handfuls of dandelions for Mrs. Shepherd. They didn't have any vases, so they plopped them into cups, caps, and crayon boxes. "Thank you, everyone," said Mrs. Shepherd. "I'll take these home." Meanwhile, Maybella raced around the schoolyard field, looking in holes, spying under rocks, and climbing up trees. She just couldn't make up her mind on which nature surprise to bring to Mrs. Shepherd. "Eeny, meeny, miny, mup. So much stuff, I might give up." "I couldn't decide which beautiful thing to share with you, Mrs. Shepherd, so I brought everything," said Maybella. "That was very, considerate of you," said Mrs. Shepherd. Later that afternoon, a TV crew from Channel 5 visited Mrs. Shepherd's class. "We are going to tape a story about Teacher Appreciation Day for tonight's news," announced the crew. The students tee-heed, giggled, snickered, and sang, "We're going to be on TV, we're going to be on TV." But when the camera flashed and the reporter flicked on his microphone and asked, "What is it you appreciate about your teacher?" all of Mrs. Shepherd's students froze. The reporter moved from student to student with his microphone, but all he got for answers were, until he got to Maybella Jean Wishy-Washy. Maybella said, "Eeny, meeny, miny, mide. So many things, I can decide." "What do I appreciate about Mrs. Shepherd?" Maybella shouted. "Everything!" And she ran to give Mrs. Shepherd a super-sized hug. "My, that was very decisive, Maybella. I appreciate you too," said Mrs. Shepherd as she returned Maybella's super-sized hug. Later that night, Mrs. Shepherd saw the whole thing on the evening news. "It sure is nice to be appreciated," she said with a smile, "but once a year is quite enough." And that's the end of our story, friends. Make sure you give your teachers a big thank you for teaching you how to read and write and tie your shoes and all kinds of other fun things. Thanks for joining me.